The questions we ask determine how we think. How we think shapes how we feel. Emotions lead to actions and actions create results. Change the question, change your life. This passage is in a small book but carries the weight of a knife that cuts through all our disguises. Your questions. Change Your Life is not a dry collection of theories but a story, a very real-life journey. A place where a person who seems to have reached his limit is forced to question himself. Is it the way we ask questions that has been shackling us for so long? Imagine, you are at the brink of despair, work is not progressing, teammates turn their backs, family is broken, you write a resignation letter, ready to give up. But instead of being freed, you are sent to see a stranger, not a consultant with ready advice. But a person who only knows how to ask questions that sound like jokes. Yet from those questions, a whole other world opens up. This book takes us along with Benkini, a true unsuman. The person who believed his worth lay in always having the answers. Until he discovered that belief was the trap. Because in every meeting, in every conversation with his wife, the implicit question he always asked himself was how to prove he was right, and the result was of course a deadlock. The paradox this work depicts is cruel. I am more insistent on finding answers. It is even easier to get stuck on the wrong question. Only when we dare to step back and change the question do we open up the possibility of change. It's not how I protect myself, it's what I can learn from this situation. It's not who's at fault, but is there another way to look at this? On Ben Joseph's journey, his questioning teacher presents him with a strange map. Choice map. On one side is the path of judgment that leads down a mud pit of blame and doubt. On the other side is the learning path that leads to creativity and collaboration. Every moment, every question we choose is a turning point. Realizing this, Ben started practicing changing direction. From stressful meetings at work to kitchen conversations with Cr. I want you, the person listening to this story, to stop for a moment and ask yourself, in your own life, what question are you living by? Maybe it was an implicit question. Repeat in your head every morning when you wake up. How not to be wrong. How to hide weaknesses. Or how to prove you are better. If those are the questions you carry, do you find yourself drifting down the path of judgment? And if so, perhaps it's time to try another question. A question that is not defensive, not closed but open. What am I missing? What can I learn? What is the best possible outcome if I dare to change? This book does not promise a shortcut. It doesn't paint a formula for instant success, it just gives us a map, some tools, questions to navigate. Principles to look back at ourselves, specific situations for us to reflect on. The rest depends on whether we have the courage to choose a different path. Ben's story is a mirror for anyone who has ever been stuck in a familiar loop. Trying to have the perfect answer, but the more I try the more I feel distant from others and from myself. Read it. I saw not just a fictional character but myself at many times, and perhaps you will see yourself somewhere in these pages too. So before we go any further, I want to ask you a question. A question only you can answer. If you changed your survival question right now, how would your life change? And before going into the book review, we encourage listeners to buy and read it to fully experience the book's content. Because only when you read this book will you understand the issues I am talking about. Please buy the book and support the author. Now let's start reviewing this book with me. The light in the office late at night always makes people feel smaller than they really are. I sat silently in front of the dark screen. Scattered papers and a draft resignation letter in a green folder. Every word I type is like a hammer hitting the remaining belief in the work I was once proud of. Now there is only misery left in the cutie where I just took up the management position. Like a dilapidated ship waiting to sink. The team I led seemed full of promise, but suddenly it was full of cracks. The meetings were like boring, silent, evasive performances that ended without a single viable idea. As for me, the one who was once praised as the solver, now stands rooted in the mess, with no answer left to save me. I was no better at home. Cr, the young wife newly married less than a year. Silently carried disappointment in eyes. Her kind questions turned into knives piercing my heart. How are things at the company? Are you okay? I waved my hand, even snapped. Just to hide the helplessness, between us gradually formed a cold invisible wall. That morning, I walked into the office of Alessa, the female director I respected. In my hand is the resignation letter. I thought she would frown, scold, and then sign to free me. But no, she laughed, a laugh that was neither sarcastic nor dismissive, but as if she had seen through everything I was hiding. I will not give up, she said, her voice calm but firm. I know you're broken, but there's still a chance. I want you to meet a friend of mine, Joseph. Work with him for 6 weeks. Then if you still want to resign, I will accept. She pushed back the application along with a sealed envelope. Here is my guess. Only opens after he finishes the process with Joseph out of Alexa's room. I found in my pocket a business card, printed simply on the front, Joseph S. Edward if Quach. The back has only one big question mark, which annoys me. All my life I have believed that my worth lies in the answer. And now I have to go to someone who claims to be the questioner. The next day, I went to the old building where Joseph worked. The heavy wooden door opened. The hallway is filled with picture frames and newspaper articles. He greeted me with a bright smile. His messy white hair reminded him of Einstein's portrait steps. The innocence in his eyes made me feel embarrassed. He started the conversation without beating around the bush. What is your greatest asset? I replied proudly. I am the answerer. People come to me for answers. So he tilted his head, his eyes seemed to look straight at me. What question guides the way you live and work? I hesitate. And then blurted out, how do I prove I'm right? Joseph smiled and nodded, as if he had just heard a confession. Then we may have found the root of the problem. For the first time, I felt my lifelong faith shaken. If the desire for righteousness itself was a trap, then I was truly trapped in a maze of my own making. That meeting lasted longer than I had expected. Joseph does not teach with dry concepts. He slowly asked, step by step forcing me to face myself, what do you think? He began. If I say that the answer is not the starting point but the question is the source, I frown my whole career. Since his days as an engineer, he has built his reputation as a solver. No technical puzzle stumps me. I'm used to being patted on the shoulder and called Ansoman. And now this old man wants to overturn that whole foundation. Joseph didn't give me time to retort. He tells stories about nomads of old. They wandered from place to place with a hidden question of how to find water until one day, someone changed the question of how water gets to us, and so appeared fields, wells, islands, and cities. A new question changed civilization. I was silent. The example is simple but hits the spot. Joseph continued. In daily life, we always ask and answer. Although I rarely realized this morning when I got dressed, I must have had a series of questions in my head. What's the weather like today? Who am I going to meet? Which shirt is both clean and suitable? Then he put the answer on himself. He looked straight at me. If the question in your mind is always how to prove yourself right, how will you live? How does that affect your team? To his wife. That question was like a mirror, clearly reflecting the scenes I avoided, the deadlocked meetings, Grace's disappointed eyes, the distance spreading from each curt sentence. I suddenly felt heavy. Joseph handed me a thin notebook labeled Question Thinking Book. He said, start by observing yourself, see what question you are asking, because every action, every result comes from that. Change the question and you will change the whole path on the way back. I felt like I had just stepped into a strange land. The pride of many years of answering now became a burden in the elevator mirror. I looked at my tired face, wondering if I had clung so tightly to the role of answerman that I had lost the ability to really listen. That night, I tried to review the recent days. How many times Gree just needed to share. I extinguished it with affirmative sentences, how many times the team wanted to participate. I made a quick judgment. I thought I was strong, but in fact I was only proving that I was infallible, and it was that insistence that pushed me away from everyone. Joseph called it the first step. Learning to ask myself the very question I was living by, I did not fully understand. But there was an intuition telling me that he was right. If I did not change, I would still sinking deeper. The next time we met, Joseph and I went to the wall of his office. There hung a large picture like a map. He called it the map of choice. On the map were two paths, one a wide, open path where small figures jogged, looking free and healthy. This path was called the path of learning. The other path was darker than gloom. Figures were walking with their heads bowed. At the end of the path was a muddy pit where someone was sinking. Despair. It was the path of judgment. Joseph pointed to the figure standing at the fork where both paths began. This is each of us at every moment. We can always choose to go towards learning or down to judgment. He took a laser pointer and scanned the key words on the map in the path of learning. The symbol was choose, in the path of judgment, the symbol was react. The two words echoed in me like a reminder. I stared at it, then suddenly felt uncomfortable. The figures on the path of judgment made me feel uneasy. I asked, half-jokingly. Do you think I belong to that group? Sinking in the mud. Joseph smiled, not mockingly, but as if to soothe. No one escapes moments of judgment, including me. It's instinctive. The important thing is not to label but to recognize where you are so you can change direction. His words made me silent. I remembered the moment in the meeting when Joss, my colleague, whom I always considered a rival, spoke up to argue. My head immediately rang with judgmental questions. He wanted to bring me down again, he was just waiting for me to slip up. It was those hidden questions that pushed me into a confrontation that made the whole group cower. Joseph suggested, try to step back and observe. When you are angry or disappointed, ask yourself which direction you are on, judging or learning. I tried that right then. How many times did memories of arguments with GR come up? I wondered. Was she trying to prove me wrong again? Was she blaming me? Just asking questions like that. I had unwittingly led myself down the slope of judgment, dragging the whole relationship down. I sighed. It turned out I wasn't stuck because I didn't have the answers, but because I was asking the wrong questions. Joseph nodded when he saw my face change. That's right. Questions are like rudders, they determine the direction. Even if you don't realize it, you can keep asking why things are bad, who's to blame, or you can try asking what you can learn here. The choice is in England. For the first time, I felt a ray of light. I understood that I wasn't completely helpless, there was a map, another turn, and I could choose on the way back. The image of that map stuck with me. The footsteps on the bright road, opposite the one sinking in the mud, were exactly like me in two possibilities. One exhausted from holding on, the other still able to open a new way, the difference was just the guiding question. After that meeting, I began to pay more attention to the voice in my head. Surprisingly, it rang more frequently than I thought. Every time things didn't go as planned in my mind, a series of questions automatically appeared. Who screwed this up? Why me? If everyone else is incompetent, how long will I have to shoulder the burden? Joseph called these questions judgmental. They come as quick as a reflex, dragging us down a slope until we end up stuck in a quagmire of doubt and anger. No one is an outsider, he emphasized. We are all survivors of judgment. The difference is recognizing it and having a choice. I recognized the bitter paradox. The more I tried to be the one with the answers, the more I was dominated by the fear of being wrong. Instead of listening, I rushed to prove. Instead of understanding, I became defensive. And so what I believed to be a strength became a burden, alienating me from my teammates and the wife I loved. One evening, I tried to talk to Grace in the kitchen, where she often asked me about my day. I heard myself about to utter the familiar, curt, dismissive response. But this time I stopped. In my mind the map image resonated in my head and I could feel myself slipping toward judgment. I took a deep breath and changed the way I asked myself, was she trying to pressure me? I wondered, what if I listened to her with curiosity? The atmosphere was tense, different from usual. Grace looked at me, surprised that I didn't react violently. We had a rare conversation that didn't end in a heavy silence, just a small change but a big difference. I began to understand Joseph's words. The question was a switch that turned us in a different direction. From darkness to light. The next day, in the team meeting, when Charles again gave an opposing opinion, I could almost hear two parallel lines of questions in my head, one familiar, was he against me? How could I prove him wrong right away? The other was new. What was in his words that I hadn't seen? What could I learn from that perspective? I was still confused, but for the first time I realized that I had a choice between the two lines of questions and feelings. It was like catching a glimpse of the way out of a maze. Joseph once said, questions not only determine how we think, they also shape our emotions, and emotions lead to action. Changing the question means changing the result. I have searched many times for all kinds of solutions to save the project but rarely thought that the source of all the deadlock lies in the questions I silently nurtured. Now I see clearly that the problem is not just in team capacity or pressure from the company but in the distorted lens I am looking at the world through. To change the scene I have to change the lens. That evening, the small kitchen became a real test of what I was learning. Chris asked about normal work while cooking. Just hearing that, I put up a wall of defense, a short answer or worse, a scowl. But this time I remember the look in Joseph's eyes when he said, "Look at yourself. What question is driving you?" I suddenly realized that the old saying was still echoing in my head. Is she prying again? She doesn't believe me. That is the judgment voice. I paused, took a deep breath, and tried to change the question. How can I make her feel included? What can I learn from her concern? GR looked up. Surprised by my longer than usual reply, we started chatting. It's not about numbers or reports, it's about feelings. I'll be honest and say that I'm struggling, that I'm not sure I'm capable, that I feel the pressure. I hesitated, afraid to disappoint her, but she just quietly put her hand on my shoulder. At that moment, the kitchen lit up and seemed unusually warm. I realized that sometimes what the other person needs is not the perfect answer but just my real presence. A few days later, we had another evening like that. This time I tried to ask Grace a question directly. What can I do to make you feel better when I'm so busy? The question popped out and surprised me. CR smiled and replied gently, as long as I listen for a few minutes every night, you will see. Just one more question. The atmosphere between us changed. I began to believe that if choice mapping could work in the kitchen, it could work in the boardroom. The next day, I brought that idea to work. When meeting, instead of affirming the plan according to my own ideas, I try to ask, does everyone see anything I haven't thought of? Are there any other options? At first the familiar silence prevailed. But then one member timidly commented, followed by another. I realize. As the question unfolded, the silence gradually broke. Of course, I haven't gotten out of my old habits yet. There are times when I still slide toward judgment, still want to refute immediately. But now I realize when I'm slipping. And sometimes it's enough to pull the brakes by changing the question, like learning to drive on a new, clumsy road. But at least I knew how to hold the steering wheel. The kitchen, which I thought was just a cooking place, suddenly became my first gym. There, I practiced asking learning questions instead of judgmental questions, and the results were evident not in the theory but in Chris's softening smile. In the gradually warming atmosphere of a meeting, Joseph said that realizing he was on the side of judgment was just the beginning. Without the tools to change direction, we can easily drift back into old habits. He introduced me to a new concept, the redirecting question. When you find yourself sliding down the judgmental slope, Joss, ask yourself, is there another way to look at this? Or what outcome do I want instead of this deadlock? It was the switch that turned him from the dark path to the light. I immediately tested with the most recent memory, the argument with Char in the meeting. That time, I immediately thought, he just wanted to prove himself incompetent. Joseph suggested, if he had asked himself at that moment if there was something in his words that he had not yet realized, what would have been the different result? I replayed the situation. And sure enough, the atmosphere in my head changed from stuffy. I saw a flash of listening ability. Joseph tells a story of his own. He once had to work with a manager who was always nagging and calling everyone stupid. Within minutes, he too was in a judgmental mood. This guy is unbearable. But when he realized he was sinking, he asked himself, how else can I look at him? That redirected question piqued his curiosity. What does this person really need? And from there the conversation opened up, no longer deadlocked. I sat quietly listening and felt like I was being scrutinized. It's true that I often get caught in that cycle, angry because of other people's judgment. Then we judge them because of our habit of judging. That night when I got home, I tried it on Grace. She asked me a question that made me upset. Are you sure you are on the right track with the company? My first reflex was to snap. You don't believe me, but in that brief moment, I remembered Joseph's words, and I had time to ask myself what she really needed from me. And the answer was clear, she needed sharing, not defense. So instead of brushing it off, I said he wasn't sure, but he was trying to figure it out. Do you want to hear what I'm trying to do? Rest paused, his eyes softening. We continued talking, and for the first time in months, I felt the tension between us lessen significantly. The next day, in a team meeting, when the atmosphere started to get tense, I remembered that tool again. One member complained, we never have enough data. My mind was about to snap, but I changed course. If we don't have enough data, what can we still do to move forward? The question was simple, but the group was silent for a moment and then began to discuss. For the first time, the meeting ended not with disappointment but with some new ideas. I realized that redirecting questions were not a trick but a way to create new space for myself and others. It was like opening a door when the room started to feel stuffy. From then on, I started to practice keeping a small store of redirecting questions with me. It was like having a few spare keys to what I really wanted, what I hadn't seen. If I was curious instead of judging, what would I ask? Every time I used them, I felt like I was given oxygen. The first weeks of working with Joseph were like looking in a mirror under a harsh light, layers of false confidence peeling away to reveal habits that I had long considered instincts that were always right, always had the answer. Words, always thinking of others as obstacles. Now I see clearly that they are the shackles that are tightening me. From the evening in the kitchen with Grace to the meeting with the team, I began to feel something that seemed simple. Just by changing the question, the atmosphere immediately changed. A judgmental question closed all doors, while a learning question opened a crack of light. Although small, it was enough for others to enter. I remembered the moment in Alexa's office when I tremblingly placed my resignation letter on the table. If she hadn't refused me at that time, if she hadn't sent me to Joseph, maybe I would have given up now. But then I also wondered, isn't the important thing that she saved me, but that she asked me the right questions at the right time? Are you ready to change? Just that sentence pulled me back from the brink. Now I carry within me two images that always go together. One side is the path of judgment, where I used to be familiar, leading straight to a dead end. The other side is the path of learning, still new but opening up hope. And between at that crossroads, I realized that I was no longer being pushed unconsciously, but could choose. Of course, I was still not proficient. There were days when I forgot everything and let my anger drive me into the mud pit. But the difference was that I realized it faster and sometimes knew how to pull the brake with a redirecting question. It was a sign that I was learning to walk on a new path, even though I still stumbled. I began to share a little with Grace about what Joseph had taught me. She listened, sometimes laughing. So he had finally learned to ask questions. That joke didn't make me uncomfortable, on the contrary, it made me feel relieved. It turned out that learning from scratch didn't make me smaller, but helped me to reduce the burden of having to appear omnipotent at work. I also tried to involve the group more with open-ended questions. The results weren't spectacular. But I saw that their eyes were less tense and I myself was no longer as exhausted as before. It seemed that when I stopped being the answerer, the atmosphere became lighter. Joseph said that this was just the beginning. I saw I had a choice, he emphasized. The next step was learning how to apply that choice to my relationships with others, my team, and my leadership role. I knew the road ahead would not be easy, but for the first time in months I no longer felt like I was going downhill at full speed. I was learning to steer in a different direction. Although I was still in a daze, I was conscious as I sat alone, remembering the envelope Alexa had given me that day. It was still in its unopened green cover. I didn't know what was inside, but now I had a hunch that the content was no longer as important as before. What was important was that I was changing, and the road ahead might be wider than I thought. That morning when I walked into the conference room, I noticed something strange. It wasn't the lights, it wasn't the whiteboard, it was the way I was looking at the faces around the table. Before, whenever Charles spoke, I immediately labeled him an opponent. As if everything he said was just to refute me. But today, I tried to look at him with new eyes, as Joseph had said. Advice. Let curiosity guide you, not judgment. When Charles made his point, I still felt the old suspicion rising. But in that moment, I wondered, what if he wasn't an adversary but someone trying to find a way out for the team? Just a different question. The image before me shifted. I no longer saw an enemy but a colleague struggling under the same pressure as me. The change made me quiet long enough to listen. And for the first time, I detected a piece of the puzzle in Char's words that I hadn't noticed before. The worry about missing data. Something we often ignored in the rush to move forward. I didn't respond. I tried an open-ended question. If we don't have enough data, what can we do to move forward without getting stuck? The room fell silent for a moment. Then another member spoke. Then another, the air seemed to split open and ideas began to flow. I sat there, amazed by the effect of a small change in how to listen and how to ask. It turned out that the difference did not come from a sophisticated strategy but from letting go of the frosted glasses I had always worn. When evening came, R asked me. Today he seemed more relaxed. I smiled and recounted what had happened. She listened attentively and then said, "Only when you listen, will people speak." That sentence seemed simple but it was like a needle touching the deepest part of me. I realized that for a long time I had been covering my ears to others because I was too afraid of being wrong. From then on, I began to practice observing not only the words but also the way I listened. There were times when I listened but my mind was struggling to find a way to respond. I tried to stop myself and ask myself if I could listen as if this was the first time. The paradox was that the less defensive I was, the more I grasped things. In the following days, I realized that my eyes were different too. I saw my teammates no longer as obstacles but as people waiting for a chance to join. I saw Grace not as someone who was judging but as someone who was worried about me. And I saw myself. Not the one who answered, but the one who was relearning how to ask questions to live. In one meeting, Joseph spread a large piece of paper on the table, on which he drew 2 circles. The first circle was called the judging team. Frowning faces, defensive words, energy drained. The second circle was the learning team. Open faces, stammering voices, curiosity evident in the eyes. He pointed at the paper and asked me, "Which circle do you think your team is more like?" I don't need to think. In my mind immediately came the scene of recent meetings, silences lasting a few sighs. Dry rebuttals. I clearly saw my team slipping into the judging circle. Joseph suggested, "Try to remember in those meetings, what was everyone's implicit question?" I was speechless. It was true that we often started with questions like who would be blamed if we failed? How can we prove our point better? Those questions were like shackles pulling everyone together. Then he looked straight at me as the leader. His questions spread the fastest. If he asked in a judgmental way, the group would go down the hole. If he asked in a learning way, the group would have a chance to climb up. His words were like an arrow to the heart. I remembered the last time a new member proposed a risky solution. Instead of asking more to understand, I dismissed it. That idea was too risky. Not surprisingly, the whole group fell silent from then on. That night, I tried to imagine my group in 2 scenarios. One was a heavy, frustrated judgment team, waiting for someone to make a decision for them. The other was a learning team, curious, daring to share, seeing mistakes as learning opportunities. The 2 contrasting pictures were like 2 futures for the project, and I knew I had to choose. The next day, when the group met, I decided to try planting a small seed instead of opening with a report. I asked, "What else do you think we can do to get out of the current impasse?" The room was silent for a few seconds. I could almost hear my heartbeat, afraid they wouldn't say anything. Then a hand slowly rose, an imperfect idea but the first sign. I nodded, listened, and thanked them. The thick silence didn't disappear overnight, but I sensed something shifting, eyes less guarded, a few fragile smiles appearing. Perhaps the group was testing the waters to see if this was really a space for learning. That night, I asked, "Do you feel like things are getting lighter?" I nodded. Yes, not just lighter for the group but for me too. When I no longer had to play the role of the rigid questioner, I could breathe more freely. I understood that turning a judging team into a learning team would take more than one meeting, more than a few questions. But I had seen the first seed, and I knew that with patience it could take root. Decision day came sooner than I thought. The project was due, the pressure was on everyone. That meeting was as tense as a broken string. The reports were all bad news. The data wasn't enough, the client was pressing, the budget was over. I saw the group looking at me, waiting for a verdict, my heart pounding, my old instincts kicking in. Give me an answer now, prove yourself worthy. But in my head I remembered what Joseph had said when things were at their most tense, that's when questions could work miracles. I swallowed and instead of issuing an order, I asked myself what I really wanted from this situation. The question was simple, but it took me back a step. I didn't want another deadlocked meeting. I wanted the group to find its spark. So I spoke up. If we weren't trapped by the fear of failure, what would we try? The room was silent. The unexpected had happened. A quiet member had an idea. Try a small model to test the hypothesis instead of waiting for complete data. This idea led to another wave. Each question asked one after another changed the atmosphere. I felt like I was witnessing something strange. With the group people, same room, but just by changing the way of asking the question, the whole atmosphere turned in another direction. Just like Joseph said, questions are the rudder of the ship. That evening, when I returned home, Chist greeted me with a relieved smile. She said, "You seem different, no longer bringing mountains of rocks home." I told her about what happened at the company. She listened and then said, "You see. When he opens, everyone opens." That statement reminded me of a conversation I had once between Christ and her best friend Jennifer. At that time, Jennifer was in a marital crisis, complaining endlessly. Christ didn't give advice right away but asked, "What do you want most in this relationship?" That question made Jennifer cry, but it also started to give her direction. I suddenly understood that the principle Joseph taught was not just for the boardroom, it was a way of living in love, in friendship, in any relationship. Questions can also turn deadlock into hope. That night, I lay in bed, tossing and turning. Is it all these years? I lived as if only answers could prove my worth. But now I'm learning that the greatest value is not having the answers, but daring to ask questions that open up new paths. Paradoxically, uncertainty becomes strength. The idea for Queen came from Joseph. He said people are too familiar with brainstorming to find answers. But the problem is not always a lack of solutions, but a lack of the right questions. Try throwing a storm of questions and see what happens. I was hesitant at first, my team was tired of the new management methods. But I remembered the time when the atmosphere changed with just one question and I decided to try. We sat around the table. I open. Today, instead of looking for solutions, we just question whatever comes up. Speak out without judgment. Not in a hurry to answer, just asked. A few people's eyes were slightly surprised, even suspicious, but then a hand raised. Are we sure we're solving the right problem? The question rang out like the first stone dropped into a lake, immediately followed by a series. If customers don't need this product, what do they really need? If we had twice the data, what would we do differently? What mistakes did we repeat from the previous project? Is there a way to test it quickly and at a lower cost? At first the questions seemed scattered, but as more came in, the atmosphere became more lively. I saw the group's eyes light up, their once reserved voices now filled with energy. The room, which was originally filled with tension, now echoed with the sound of writing and laughter. After nearly an hour, the white wall was filled with questions. Looking back, I'm overwhelmed. We generated over 50 questions, many of which no one had ever thought of, and a few that shined a light on the root causes we had previously avoided. Are we trying to perfect a product that may not be suitable? Is it necessary to do it all now, or should I just focus on a part to test first? That last question opens up a specific direction. Instead of trying to perfect the whole thing, build a prototype and bring it to market early to test it. The idea immediately excited the group, as if they had just found a way out of a maze. I sat there, both participating and observing. For the first time I saw the group as a real learning team, curious, cohesive, unafraid to make mistakes. And I also see myself differently. I am no longer the answer, but become the initiator. All the progress at work was a relief, but my personal life was in turmoil. That evening, Grace looked at me with heavy eyes. She said, "No matter how busy you are, you must remember that I am still here. But lately I feel as if you have left, my heart aches, old reflexes arise. I don't understand you at all." I almost blurted out. But then realized he was falling into a familiar pit of judgment. Joseph once emphasized that in love, the questions we ask ourselves are more decisive than those in the boardroom. I took a deep breath and changed direction. I asked myself, What did she really need right now? And the answer came clearly, not an excuse, but presence. So I let down my defenses, looked straight at her, and asked, "How do you feel when you say that?" CR paused, probably surprised that I didn't react harshly. Then she confided, "I felt left behind, as if the work had swallowed me up." Hearing those words, I felt a pang in my heart. Before, I used to take it as a reprimand and immediately put up a wall. But this time I just listened in silence. I asked further, "What can I do to make you feel closer?" The question made her tear up. Rest replied softly, "Just give me some real time, don't let your mind wander elsewhere." We sat together longer than usual, no longer arguing but having a real conversation. I felt the tension of the past months melt away. Make way for a new connection. The next morning, when I looked in the mirror, I felt different. Not because the work was progressing, but because I had just overcome a hidden battle with my own defensive habits. This time I chose to learn rather than judge, and as a result, the love did not wear away further. All day I thought about the paradox Joseph had spoken of. A question can be a weapon or a medicine, depending on how you use it. It was true. Just one open-hearted question turned that night from an abyss to a new beginning. The next day, I walked into the conference room feeling different. Not the heaviness that I had to have an answer, but a curiosity. What would the group see today that we had never seen before? When everyone as people settled down, I opened the conversation. Instead of starting with a report, I wanted to ask, if we could do just one thing to move the project forward, what would it be? The question popped out, the room fell silent. I looked around without forcing, just waiting. A young member raised his hand and said the idea of focusing on a small customer segment first. This time I didn't rush to judge. I nodded and asked again. What benefits could that idea bring? What risks should we consider? Immediately, many other hands rose from the same question. The whole discussion opened up. I could clearly see the atmosphere change. The usual tense eyes gradually replaced with excitement. Some people were still reserved, but at least they started to try to participate. I understood that leading by questions does not mean avoiding decisions, but creating conditions for collective intelligence to be released before finalizing the direction. During the discussion, I remembered what Joseph said. A leader who knows how to ask questions does not hide the fact that he also has limits. He not need to be the source of all the answers, but the one who opens the flow of questions that the group follows. With that in mind, I tried something difficult for myself. Admitting that I wasn't sure, I said, "I don't have all the answers, but I believe we can find out if we keep asking the right questions." The room fell silent for a moment, then seemed to lighten. It was as if the group had been waiting for this statement for a long time. After the meeting, a colleague approached and whispered, "I feel like this is different. We feel like we're really involved." That made me understand that the seed was taking root and slowly coming back. When she told GR about it, she smiled. It sounded like he was becoming a completely different person, I think not really different but returning to what he should be, someone who exists not just to prove himself right but to create what is right with others. I lay thinking for a long time before. I believe that the power of leadership lies in the ability to be decisive, to give orders quickly. Now I've learned a paradox. Sometimes the power lies in stopping to ask and having the courage to listen to answers that may not be what I want. Looking back, I can hardly believe that in just a few weeks my world has changed so much. Not because of a supernatural miracle but because of a series of seemingly small choices. Changing a question, listening for an extra minute, daring to admit that I don't know. But it was those moments that lined up to form a new path. I clearly remember the first day I walked into Alessa's room with the resignation letter in office. I thought the game was over. Now I find myself not only staying but also standing in a different position. Not the one who holds all the answers but the one who opens the flow of questions to go further with everyone. At the company, my team began to change. Meetings were no longer a place of repression but a place where ideas were sown, not always smoothly. There were still collisions, there was still silence. But under the surface there was a new movement. Curiosity gradually replaced doubt, cooperation replaced defense. At home, the relationship with Grace was different too. We still disagreed but there were no longer cold walls. I learned to ask, what do you need from me? Instead of why do you blame me? And that question saved us many times from falling into the same pit. Joseph once said that questions are the most powerful tool of human beings. Now I believe. Because I have lived through this paradox. When I hold on to the answer, I am narrow. But when I dare to admit that I do not know, and by asking questions, I opened up a whole new world. I started to write down a personal list. The key questions became a compass. What do I really want in this situation? What am I missing? What do others need from me right now? What is the best possible outcome? And what can I learn if I don't get it? Each question is a small detour, but together they define the whole journey. When I last spoke with Joseph, he looked at me with a gentle gaze. He had begun to become a question leader. The journey did not stop here. He would have to use other tools ahead. The 10 doors we had opened, but now he had a foundation. I left his office. In my hand was still the envelope Alessa had given me that day. I had not opened it. Because now I no longer needed a prophecy to believe in the future. I believed in the ability to ask the right questions at the right time, and I believed that it would take me further than any answer. That evening, sitting next to Grace, I silently knew that this journey was not only about saving a project but also opening up a way of life. I was no longer a lone fighter but a companion, knowing how to ask, knowing how to listen, and willing to learn with others. When a story ends, people often wait for a conclusion as if everything will be summarized in a few words. But I want to leave you not with a conclusion but with a question. If every path you take starts with a question in your mind, which question will you choose to guide your life from tomorrow? Stop for a moment and look back at yourself. How many times in a normal day do you ask yourself who is wrong? Why do I have to suffer? How can I prove I am right? And then those questions drag you down the abyss of fatigue that makes everything heavy. Maybe you have touched another moment. When you ask yourself what you can learn, what does the other person really need from you? Is there another way to look at this? And suddenly the space around you opens up out, not as stifling as before. The most important lesson from this journey is not a specific tool, nor is it just the map of choices or the redirecting questions, but awareness. We can choose the type of questions that will lead us. No one else can decide for us. Every moment is a fork in the road, either turning towards judgment or stepping towards learning. The paradox is that the path we think is the fastest, proving ourselves right, often leads to a dead end, while the slower path, curious learning, opens up solutions. When I recount what I have experienced, I do not want to paint it as a miracle that can change everything overnight. The truth is that this change is fragile and easy to slip. Sometimes I still find myself falling back into the old spiral, but it is that realization that becomes strength. Knowing where I am, knowing I can choose again. That is true freedom. Maybe you are thinking about how to apply it to your life. I do not have a general formula, but here's a suggestion. Start with the small moments. The next time you're about to argue with a loved one, ask yourself, do you want to prove something or do you want to connect? The next time a coworker annoys you, ask, is there something here that I'm not seeing? Just one different question can change the direction of the conversation. And I want to ask you a bigger question. If you could only live by one question for the rest of your life, which one would you choose? Would it be a closed, judgmental question or a question that opens the possibility of learning and transformation? Think carefully because the question you carry with you today could determine your life tomorrow. Thank you for coming with me on this journey. I know there will be moments that make you pause. Maybe out of empathy, maybe because you've touched on a personal pain. If so, let those feelings be a sign that you're still truly alive, still yearning for a more worthwhile life. I'll stop here. But the conversation doesn't end there. It just moves into another space where you are in charge. With the questions you choose for yourself, I hope when we meet again, you will tell me which question took you the farthest. See you.